The prairie was wide, endless, and empty, yet one sound carried through it like a heartbeat, the steady thud of wood striking wood. A woman stood alone, her hands rough and calloused, lifting one log at a time. The sun burned hot against her back, the air dry with dust, but she did not stop. Each log was heavy, each movement slow, but her determination was stronger than the weight she carried. She was building something that was hers, something no one could take away, a cabin rising from nothing but her grit and her will. From a distance he watched. A cowboy, weathered by years of solitude, sat on his horse at the edge of the ridge. His eyes followed every movement she made. She did not see him, but he had been there before, always far enough to go unnoticed. The land had taught him silence, and silence was all he had lived with since the day his home had gone cold, since the day he buried the only warmth he had ever known. She bent, pulled, lifted, and placed another log. The wall grew higher, her shadow stretching longer across the dirt. Sweat ran down her brow, soaking the cloth she used to tie her hair back. She looked fragile to anyone who didn't pay attention, but the cowboy knew better. He had seen men crumble under lighter burdens. She did not crumble. Still, he wondered. Why was she alone? The frontier was not kind to women, not to anyone without a hand to share the load. Was she running from something or running to something? A broken past, a lost family, a dream no one else dared to claim. He could not know, but he felt the pull of her struggle, and it settled heavy in his chest. The cowboy was a widower, carrying years of silence inside him. Watching her stirred something he had buried deep, something that whispered of family, of laughter, of belonging. Yet he stayed where he was, hands gripping the reins, afraid to move closer. He told himself he was only curious, only passing time. But the truth pressed harder with every log she laid. Her fight reminded him of everything he once had, and everything he still longed for. Each morning began the same. The air was cold, sharper than a knife, and the mist clung to the low grass like a secret unwilling to let go. The woman rose before the sun had fully broken the horizon, tying back her braids and wrapping her shawl tight against the chill. She had no one to speak to, no one to share the quiet with, only the rhythm of her own breath as she stepped outside to face the day's work. Her world was the half-built cabin, the pile of logs waiting to be shaped, and the stretch of wild land that seemed endless. The cabin stood like a skeleton, 4 rough walls just beginning to rise, the bones of a home that did not yet exist. Every log she dragged into place seemed to fight against her, each one demanding strength she could not spare but somehow found. She carried them on her shoulders, pushed them along the dirt, lifted them with aching arms. When her muscles trembled, she stopped only long enough to breathe, then pushed again. Her hands were covered with scrapes and blisters, her nails broken and dirty. Yet she did not complain. Her silence was a shield, and her determination was louder than words. The prairie around her was not kind. Some days the wind blew so hard it scattered her tools, whistling through the unfinished walls like a taunt. Other days the sun bore down without mercy, burning her skin and leaving her lips cracked and dry. Still, she worked. A lone figure against the vastness, building something piece by piece, as if proving to the land itself that she would not be broken. From a distance, the cowboy watched. He did not ride up close, not yet, but he was there more often than she could have guessed. Sometimes he watched from the ridge, his horse standing still as stone beneath him. Other times he paused at the far line of the trees, letting the branches hide his figure. He told himself he was only curious, that there was no harm in watching. But his eyes lingered longer each time, drawn by the rhythm of her persistence. He knew the weight of loneliness better than most. His ranch had gone quiet years ago, when laughter had left with his wife's final breath. The house he lived in now was only wood and roof, not a home. He filled his days with work, his nights with silence, but nothing could fill the hollow inside him. And so he found himself watching her, this woman who worked harder than any man he had ever known, who fought the land with nothing but her bare hands and unyielding will. Her struggle stirred something he thought was long gone. He remembered the sound of a hammer striking nails, the smell of fresh-cut wood, the feel of someone beside him, working toward the same dream. Watching her raise her cabin was like watching hope take shape, a reminder of what it felt like to build more than walls, to build a future. There were moments when he almost rode down to her, times when she stumbled under the weight of a log and his hands itched to lift it for her, times when the wind nearly tore the roof frame from her grasp and he wanted to steady it. But each time he stopped himself. He feared she might see him as a stranger, or worse, as someone trying to take what was hers. He knew enough about pride to understand she was fighting not only for shelter, but for the right to claim her own place in a world that rarely offered kindness. Still, he lingered. He noticed how she paused sometimes, standing tall with her hand pressed to her back, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. He saw how her eyes scanned the horizon, cautious, as if expecting danger. He wondered what story had brought her here. Was she fleeing someone or chasing freedom? Was she alone by choice, or because life had left her no other option? The questions pressed at him, yet he had no answers. At night, when she lit a small fire outside the cabin, its glow flickered faintly against the prairie dark. The cowboy would see it from his distance, the flame barely a star on the horizon, but it anchored him. He stayed longer than he should, his horse shifting beneath him as he listened to the lonely howl of the coyotes and the crackle of her fire carried on the wind. It was as though the sight of her flame gave him a reason to linger in the night, instead of riding back to his empty ranch. Her persistence reminded him of something fragile yet unbroken in his own heart. He felt a quiet ache as he watched her sit by the fire alone, a bowl in her hands, her shoulders slumped from the day's labor. He thought of the evenings he had once known, sitting with his wife, talking about nothing and everything. The memories cut sharp, but they also stirred warmth. And in that warmth, he found himself wishing he could step into the light of her fire just once, to share even a single word. But he stayed where he was in the shadows. He told himself it was safer this way, safer for her, safer for him. The prairie was cruel to those who reached too far. He knew how it punished the hopeful. So he watched quietly, his longing buried deep, as she lifted one log after another, building her dream one piece at a time. The morning air carried the bite of frost, even though the sun was climbing higher. The woman's breath formed pale clouds as she wrestled another log across the dirt, her body swaying under the weight. She dropped it with a thud near the growing wall of her cabin and paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. Her muscles ached, her palms were raw, and yet she reached for the axe again. One more log, then another, then another. Her body was tired, but her eyes burned with focus. She wasn't only building walls. She was carving out a place in the wilderness that could not be taken from her. The cowboy had risen early too, though for different reasons. Sleep rarely came easy to him anymore. The bed at his ranch was too wide, too empty. When dawn touched the land, he saddled his horse and let it carry him across the plains. He told himself he was riding to check the water lines, or the fence posts, or the cattle, but more often than not, his horse found its way toward the ridge overlooking her homestead. Today was no different. He rode slowly, stopping at the familiar spot where he could see her without being seen. From his place on the ridge, he watched her work. He noticed the way her shoulders bent but did not break, the way she straightened after each strain as if daring the land to defy her. He saw her lips pressed tight in determination, her braids swinging as she lifted and dropped each log into place. He admired her strength, but more than that, he admired her will. She was alone, and still she pushed forward as if loneliness itself was another obstacle she had decided she would overcome. As the hours passed, the sound of her work carried across the prairie, the crack of the axe, the scrape of wood, the hollow thump of logs colliding. Each sound tugged at the cowboy's chest, reminding him of his own past, of the days when he and his wife had built their life together, one board, one nail, one laugh at a time. Now that cabin stood empty, its rooms quiet, its warmth gone. Watching this woman was like staring at a memory that refused to fade, a glimpse of something he had lost and still longed for. She stumbled once while dragging a log, her knee buckling under the weight. He flinched in his saddle, his fingers tightening on the reins, ready to ride down and help. But she caught herself, steadied her body, and kept going. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She didn't want saving. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. At midday, she stopped to drink from a small clay cup, her chest rising and falling as she sat on the stump near her cabin. The cowboy watched her shoulders relax for the first time that morning. She glanced at the horizon, her gaze sweeping across the land, sharp and searching. For a moment he thought her eyes had found him. His heart kicked hard in his chest, but she turned away, staring instead at the endless prairie stretching before her. She looked so small against the vastness, and yet he felt she was larger than it all, her spirit rising higher than the sky itself. The cowboy's stomach churned with a strange mix of admiration and longing. He had kept himself apart for so long, convinced that the world had taken its last gift from him when his wife's laughter went silent. But watching her, this woman building her home log by log, cracked something inside him. It stirred a hunger he had buried beneath years of silence, the hunger for family, for companionship, for a reason to come home at night to more than an empty chair. Still, he held back. He knew the prairie was not gentle with those who hoped too quickly. He had seen men approach women alone in the wilderness and offer help that came with chains. He would not be mistaken for one of them. He would wait, watching, until the right moment revealed itself. The sun arced across the sky, shadows stretching long across the dirt. The woman worked until her arms shook, until the logs were stacked higher, until the walls of her dream rose another foot above the ground. She stopped only when the light began to fade, her body sagging with exhaustion. She lit a fire near the cabin and sat beside it, her back straight but her eyes heavy. The cowboy lingered on the ridge, the firelight flickering like a star in the growing dark. He wanted to ride down, to share even a word with her, to sit near that fire and feel the warmth of human company again. But he stayed where he was, his horse shifting beneath him as the night deepened. He told himself tomorrow would be the same. She would work, he would watch, and the space between them would remain. Yet as the coyotes began their cries across the land, he felt the pull stronger than ever. He was a widower, carrying silence in his heart. She was a woman building a cabin alone, carrying strength in her hands. Both had chosen survival in their own way. But the question gnawed at him as he turned back toward his ranch. How long could he stand on the outside, watching, before the need to step closer became too strong to resist? The fire had burned low inside her cabin, its light glowing softly across the unfinished walls. She sat on the floor near the hearth, her blanket drawn around her shoulders, her eyes heavy from the day's labor. The logs stacked high outside still waited for her, but for now her body begged for rest. She traced her fingers over a rough-hewn beam, the wood cool beneath her touch. Every mark on it carried the memory of her struggle, splinters, cuts, the strength she had poured into raising it. This was not just a cabin. It was her stand against the loneliness of the world, her defiance against the silence that had swallowed too many lives. The cowboy had returned to his ranch before dusk, though his thoughts had not stayed there. His small house sat in the shadows of cottonwoods, its windows dark, its walls echoing with the quiet that had grown too familiar. He sat by his own fire, staring at the flames as they cracked and popped. But what he saw was not the logs burning in front of him. He saw her, her arms straining under the weight of timber, her face streaked with sweat, her eyes locked on the cabin as though nothing else in the world existed. He had watched her fight through pain and fatigue, and the memory of it refused to let him go. He tried to push the thought aside, tried to convince himself it wasn't his concern. She was strong enough, stubborn enough to make her own way. He was just a man watching from a distance, nothing more. Yet the hollow inside him grew larger with each passing day. His wife's voice haunted him in moments like this, the way she had laughed, the way she had reminded him that no man was meant to carry his life in silence. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second he thought he heard her again, urging him not to let the world turn him to stone. The next morning, the frost was sharp on the ground, glittering beneath the pale light of dawn. The woman stepped out with her axe, her breath rising in small clouds. She walked to the pile of logs, her muscles stiff but ready. The prairie stretched wide and quiet, the only sound the rhythm of her work beginning once more. She did not know that he was closer this time. The cowboy had ridden out earlier than usual, his horse's hooves muffled against the frozen earth. He stopped at the line of trees near her cabin, not far enough to hide, but not so near that his presence would be bold. He leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes locked on her movements. Something inside him had shifted. He was no longer satisfied to remain only a shadow on the ridge. He needed to be closer, even if it was only a step. He watched as she bent to lift a log thicker than her shoulders. She braced herself, gripping it with both arms, her knees straining as she hoisted it upward. For a moment, it looked as though she might manage, but then her foot slipped on the frozen ground. The log lurched sideways, crashing down against her shoulder before thudding to the dirt. She stumbled, her body crumpling beside it. The cowboy was off his horse before he could think. His boots struck the ground hard, the reins slipping from his grip. He moved across the frozen grass in long strides, his heart pounding. She tried to push herself up, her face twisted in pain, but the log pinned her arm awkwardly. Her teeth clenched as she fought to free herself, refusing to cry out, refusing to yield. He reached her in seconds, his hands gripping the log. "Don't move," he muttered, his voice rough from years of disuse. She froze, her eyes snapping up to meet his. For the first time, their gazes locked. Her dark eyes burned with surprise, suspicion, and something else, defiance. She did not ask for his help, but she did not stop him either. He lifted the log in one powerful motion and shoved it aside. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her shoulder, her breathing sharp. She stared at him as though measuring whether he was a threat. He held her gaze, steady and calm, though his chest was tight. "You'll hurt yourself if you try to lift them all alone," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that seemed to hang in the cold air between them. For a long moment she said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as though she were deciding whether to send him away. But then her shoulders dropped slightly, her hand still pressed to her shoulder. She turned back toward the logs, her silence louder than words. He didn't push her. He simply picked up another log, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and carried it toward the wall of her cabin. She watched him, her expression unreadable, as he set it in place with practiced ease. When he stepped back, he didn't look at her. He reached for another log. Her eyes followed him as though she couldn't decide what to make of him. She had built every piece of this cabin with her own hands, and letting someone else touch it felt like surrender. Yet there was no denying the relief in her aching muscles as she saw him lift the heavy wood with ease. She turned away, walking back toward the hearth, but her steps were slower now, less rigid. The cowboy worked beside her in silence, each movement steady and purposeful. He did not speak again, nor did he ask questions. He simply helped, one log at a time, his presence quiet but undeniable. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her struggle. As the day wore on, the walls of the cabin rose higher. Together, they placed beams, adjusted angles, and secured each log into place. Still, not a single word passed between them. Only the rhythm of work, the sound of wood against wood, and the unspoken understanding that had begun to form. When dusk finally fell, the woman stepped back and stared at the progress. Her breath trembled in the cool evening air. The cowboy wiped his brow with his sleeve, his chest heaving from the day's labor. She glanced at him again, her eyes softer now, though her lips remained sealed. He nodded once, a simple gesture, then turned back toward his horse. The fire inside her cabin was waiting, and so was his own silence. But something had shifted. The distance between them had changed, and neither could deny it. The next morning broke with a pale sky, streaked in soft pink and gray. The prairie was hushed, but the woman's cabin was already alive with the sound of work. She swung her axe into another log, the crack echoing like a drumbeat across the land. Her shoulder was still sore from yesterday's fall, but she ignored the pain, setting her jaw with determination. Each strike was deliberate, each breath sharp. She had always done this alone, and she had convinced herself she always would. Yet her eyes strayed more often now, drifting to the horizon where he had come from. The cowboy had returned before dawn, though he told himself he had no reason to. He tethered his horse near the trees and walked quietly across the frosted ground, his boots crunching the thin layer of ice that clung to the earth. He expected her to refuse his help, maybe even send him away. But when she saw him, she only hesitated for a moment. Her gaze lingered on him, wary but not unkind. Then she turned back to her work without a word, as though silently granting him permission. He joined her, lifting logs, steadying beams, carrying weight that had once threatened to break her. They worked without speaking, their movements falling into rhythm, like two pieces of a song that had been waiting to meet. The silence between them was not empty now, it was full of unspoken questions, unshared stories, and something fragile neither dared to name. When the wind rose, tugging at her shawl and scattering dust through the air, he steadied the roof beam she struggled to hold. Their hands brushed briefly, rough skin against rough skin, and both pulled back quickly. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp and questioning, while his stayed steady calm. There was no need to explain. The land had its own way of weaving bonds without words. Hours slipped by, and together they raised a wall that might have taken her a week alone. The sun climbed higher and sweat clung to their brows. She wiped her face with her sleeve, her braids sticking to her cheeks, while he leaned against a log, his chest rising with heavy breaths. For the first time in years he felt alive, his body straining not out of duty, but out of choice. He glanced at her, noticing the quiet strength in her stance, the way she carried herself even when exhaustion threatened to bend her. By midday, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, hesitant, as if unused to being shared. "Why are you here?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the logs they carried. He didn't answer right away. His hands rested on the rough wood, his eyes fixed on the dirt at his feet. Finally he said, "Because you shouldn't have to fight this land alone." Her lips pressed into a line, unreadable, but she did not argue. She turned back to her work, though her movements slowed, as if she were thinking of his words. The silence returned, but it was different now. Something had shifted, a door cracked open that could not be closed again. Later, as shadows stretched across the ground, a sound broke the rhythm of their day, the distant thud of hooves. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. He followed her gaze and saw them too, 3 riders in the distance, their silhouettes blurred by dust but unmistakable in their intent. Her body stiffened. She dropped the tool in her hand and moved closer to the cabin wall, her shoulders tense. He watched the way her chest rose with unease, the way her fingers clenched tightly at her sides. Whoever those men were, she knew them. The cowboy stepped closer, his hand brushing the rifle slung across his back. "You know them?" he asked. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was enough. Fear, laced with something harder, anger. The riders slowed as they drew near, stopping just short of the cabin. Their horses snorted, pawing at the ground, while their eyes settled on the scene before them. A woman standing at her half-built cabin and a cowboy beside her. One of the men called out, his voice sharp, carrying easily through the still air. "Didn't think you'd last this long out here." His words were laced with mockery, his grin cruel beneath the brim of his hat. Another spat into the dirt, muttering something to his companion that drew a laugh. The woman's hands trembled, but she stood tall. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her, his voice calm but firm. "Best keep riding," he said. The men exchanged glances, their amusement faltering. One leaned forward in his saddle, sneering. "And who are you to tell us what to do? Looks like she found herself a savior." The cowboy didn't flinch. His rifle remained at his side, but his presence carried a weight that made the air heavier. The riders lingered a moment longer, their eyes burning with unspoken threats, before finally tugging their reins and turning their horses. Dust rose as they rode away, their laughter carried faintly on the wind. The woman exhaled, her shoulders sagging with the release of tension. The cowboy turned to her, his eyes steady. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. He nodded slowly. "Then I'll be here." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing past the rugged lines of his face and into the truth of his words. For a long moment neither moved, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then she bent, picking up her tool again, her body trembling but her will unbroken. He picked up the next log, setting it on his shoulder. Together they turned back to the cabin, the shadow of danger still looming, but the work continuing all the same. The nights grew colder, and with them came longer shadows. The woman worked by the firelight now, finishing tasks she once left for the sun. The cabin was taller, stronger, its shape taking form in the wilderness, but every beam she lifted reminded her of the riders who had come. She had seen the way they looked at her, like scavengers circling prey, like men who would not forget. Her hands worked faster than before, as if she believed the sooner her walls rose, the sooner she might be safe behind them. But the prairie was not so simple. The cowboy kept his word. Each morning he arrived before the frost had melted, and each evening he lingered until the light was gone. At first he kept his distance, his presence steady but unspoken, but as the days passed he drew nearer, his hands taking up more of the burden. Together they split logs, set beams, hammered supports into place. Their silence was no longer sharp with suspicion but heavy with meaning. She had not asked for him, and he had not asked for her, yet something tied them together now, as strong as the rope that bound each log to the frame of her cabin. One evening, as they stacked the final logs of a wall, she spoke softly, almost as if to herself. "This place, it is all I have." Her hands brushed the wood, her voice low and rough. "They think I should leave, but I won't." He looked at her, his eyes steady in the dim glow of the fire. He did not answer right away, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of truth. "Then you won't face it alone." Her gaze lingered on him, the firelight flickering across her dark eyes. She gave the smallest nod before turning back to her work. That was enough. But the land was restless, and so were the men who had ridden away that day. The signs of their return showed before their faces did, hoofprints near the stream, smoke on the horizon, a shot echoing in the distance when no game was near. The cowboy noticed them first. His senses, honed by years of loss and survival, told him the danger was circling closer. He tightened the straps on his saddle, checked the rounds in his rifle, and began to keep watch through the nights. She saw the change in him, though he said little. His eyes searched the horizon more often. His hands lingered near his weapon even while he worked. When the coyotes howled, his head lifted sharply, as if waiting for another sound beneath it. She understood then what his presence truly meant. He was not only helping her build, he was preparing to protect. The riders came back at dusk. This time there were 4 of them, their shapes cutting dark against the fading sky. They didn't laugh when they approached. Their horses stomped the earth, restless, as the men reined them in a few paces from the cabin. The woman stood straight, her chin lifted, though her chest was tight with fear. The cowboy stepped beside her, his rifle slung ready across his arm. One of the riders leaned forward, his voice cold. "You've had your fun. Time to pack up and leave." The cowboy's answer was calm, his tone even. "She's not leaving, and neither am I." A tense silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire behind them. The riders shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near pistols. The woman felt her pulse hammer in her throat. Every muscle in her body screamed to move, to run, but she stood firm, her shoulder brushing his. One of the men spat into the dirt. "This ain't your fight, cowboy. Walk away now, and maybe we let you keep breathing." The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his stance unshaken. "It became my fight the moment you left her hanging." The words struck like a hammer. The riders tensed, their faces hardening, their intent clear. For a heartbeat the world stood still, the prairie hushed, the air thick, the fire snapping in the silence. Then one of the men kicked his horse forward and the spell broke. The cowboy raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the sound of the hammer cocking echoing sharp through the twilight. The horse reared, the rider jerking back with a curse, his pistol half drawn but not fired. The standoff stretched, brittle as glass, ready to shatter. The woman stepped forward then, her voice carrying through the still air. "This land is mine. This cabin is mine. You'll not take it." Her words rang fierce, though her body trembled. For the first time, the riders looked directly at her, and something in her eyes made them pause. After a long moment, the leader pulled his reins tight. "This isn't over," he growled, his face twisting with anger. He turned his horse, and the others followed, their figures swallowed by the falling night. The cowboy lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving with the breath he had held. The woman's fists unclenched, the strength draining from her limbs. The danger had passed, but it had left its shadow behind. They returned to the cabin, the fire casting long flickering shapes across the logs they had stacked together. She sank to her knees by the hearth, her hands shaking, while he stood nearby, his eyes still on the door, his body tense. The silence between them now was not empty. It was full of everything they had faced, everything they had not yet said. She lifted her gaze to him at last. Her eyes glistened with exhaustion, but behind them was something else, trust. For the first time she let it show. He met her look, his own heavy with a longing he had carried too long. Neither spoke, but both understood. The wind pressed against the walls, testing the strength of the cabin. The beams held firm, steady against the dark. Inside, two lives sat close to the fire, bound by struggle, by loss, and by the fragile beginning of something new.